you very much for coming. We also, of course, have with us our dear colleague and friend, Slovenian Norwegian friend, Christian Mu. He's an independent researcher and also an expert, of course, among others, also in this field. Before we start our discussion, I have some announcements to make. First of all, unfortunately, dear colleague, whose attendance we announced in advance, our colleague Bengt-Ove, respected, well-known scholar, philosopher of education, basically, who wrote so many works about education and also religion and education here in Slovenia. He could, at the end, not join us because of health reasons, so he's sending his greetings and his deep apologies for this. I'm also very sorry that he's not here, but life is sometimes like this. And then again, we have an apology. I just received it 10 minutes ago from the representative of the Ministry of Education. He was held to some other meeting, and he wished us a very good job and work and so on. Why is this? Why am I mentioning this at all? It's because we do have some small project. Just recently we started some small 2-year project. When I say small, I mean it's for a very little amount of money, but it is something which was offered by the Ministry of Education. And Anna Pugachnik here is our new young colleague who is part-time employed in this project. And this project is, of course, dealing with the challenges of different questions imposed to the public educational system connected with religion. And this is exactly the topic we are going to discuss today here. You can imagine, and some of you know already, that this is a very complex field, that we have many difficult issues in this field. So we'll basically try to think a little bit here in these 90 minutes or more or less which we have here today. We'll try to think about whether should we at all teach our children about religion, and if yes, then in what way? And this may sound like a very simple question, but it's not at all. And then we'll see, but we'll also try to open at least some dilemmas which are imposed when religious symbols are entering the spaces of public school. Should there be place for crosses on the walls? What do we do if a female student, Muslim student, comes with a headscarf on her head, and so on and so on. So these huge directions are maybe starting point for our discussions. But maybe let's start with a very basic question, and then we'll see where it will get us. And yes, of course, just give us some time at the beginning. We'll try to do some discussion here. But very soon I will invite all of you, of course, to join the discussion. So please just write down your questions, remember them, questions and remarks or whatever you have. So you are more than welcome to join. Just give us first half an hour or so to warm up the room, and then you are more than welcome to join. So yeah, I will start with this basic question: should we teach about religion our kids or not? And if yes, how and why? Maybe. Yeah. So, and maybe we give the first word to our dear colleague from Denmark, Karna, please.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we agree in the working group that democratic, open, pluralistic societies needs citizens with a qualified knowledge and analytical critical skills in order to be able to be a good citizens. And that also includes analytical critical skills in order to analyze and discuss and explain issues about religion and religious topics in the world, and of course all kinds of discussions about possible relations between religion and politics and cultural heritage and all these kind of discussions. And ideally, I also think that it should be based on a study of religion approach. Yeah, and it should be a normal compulsory subject without any opt-out possibility as well. So it has to live up, of course, to the human rights and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is a very clear stance on it. Not everybody in the field of study of religions would agree, I think. As far as I know, we here do agree on this. But it's not so self-understandable that yes, we should teach children about religion as a special subject, just a normal school subject, and especially important in a non-theological way. I understood you correctly, right?
Yeah.
Non-theological way, which is in line with the religious studies, knowledge and methodology we developed during the decades, and which is also critical. So we should teach them about religion in a very similar way than we teach other subjects, language or physics, mathematics. Is this in spite of the fact that religion is a little bit different? It is, isn't it? I mean, religion is different than teaching the language or mathematics, or not? Because you say we should just teach it in this very same way. So maybe Bengt-Ove, a more difficult question to you.
Well, I guess you might treat it as a quite different thing compared to language, to art, to culture. But it does not necessarily have to be completely different. It's all a matter of how you define or approach religion. And here we approach one of the difficult things relating to religion in public school. What is actually religion? What can we in this room here and now agree is religion? And one of the main difficulties is that in order to study religion, to do research on religion, we cannot approach religion as something that exists in itself. We don't have the methodology to study such thing. And some people might say, or a critical study of religion's approach will say that religion does not exist in itself. The only thing we can agree that we can study as scholars of religion is that what people say or how people describe how they experience religion. So in that way, when we study religion, we are not studying religion as something that exists within this glass or something. We research it and we study it as a human phenomenon. Because without humans, religion does not exist. And when I say that, when I argue that, when I present that kind of argument,
It exists.
but is this religion? This water, isn't it? But the water can be divine. But is it divine because you say so, or is it divine in itself? And that's a matter of belief also. And mentioning this is actually a debate of what religion is. If you read study of religion, a theory in study of religion, you always, for some, sooner or later, you have to deal with the discussion about how to define religion. What is religion? And what I just described to you or mentioned to you, that religion is a human phenomenon. We cannot study religion without humans. That's kind of a study of religion's approach. Because it's not possible to study religion in itself. And some people will say, this is where we enter the discussion between the study of religion and theology. If you anticipate or if you argue that there is religion somewhere existing in another sphere besides human culture or human beings, then it's a matter of belief. Or you might say that, okay, it might exist, we just haven't found a way to research that. But the study of religions will say that religion in itself does not exist. Religion in itself exists only where there's human beings. And saying that might be, even in this room, some of you might say, oh, who is this fool from Norway saying that religion does not exist? It's always some kind of provocative argument and saying that religion is a human social cultural phenomenon. And when you present these kind of arguments, you always have the counter arguments of from not just Christians or Muslims or people that are religious themselves, but other people say that I'm not religious, but there are something spiritual. And spiritual, most people think that relate to something spiritual, or it's more natural for many people to talk about something spiritual, because religion is, the concept of religion, the word religion is quite politicized, it's difficult to understand, but most people can relate to something spiritual. And if we go to a building, it's very dark, we have lights, maybe we could all agree that there's something spiritual going on for some reason. But the concept of religion is important because it also has something to do with RE in school. The reason why I took the opportunity to this long answer is that the study of religion's approach to religion is important in arguing that RE, or teaching religion in school, should be considered as teaching language or arts or history, because it's a human phenomenon. And when I say it's a human phenomenon, I don't want to reduce it to say it is important. It's extremely important for many people, but it's still a human phenomenon. But because of religion is important for human beings, and has been important for cultures, both past and present, it's important to know something about this phenomenon called religion, because it affects society, it affects culture in different ways, it relates to politics. And if we believe that it is important for schools, for our children in school, to get knowledge about society, knowledge of Slovenia's history, knowledge about arts, media, then knowledge about religion should be a part of it. And that's why it's important to have some knowledge about to gain some knowledge about religion, and it's important to have RE, or religion, as a subject in school.
Okay, some people would claim that even the ones who would agree with this, what you just said, would then say, okay, but couldn't we just inform students within other subjects, you know, when we are talking about the importance of religion for Slovenian or Norwegian or whatever, history, then the classes of history, and or the classes of language or geography or society, or whatever classes we have. Why do we need a special subject on RE? Do we have any good arguments, counter arguments to this, or not? Anyway.
Yeah, well, I guess there's been some research into how teaching when facts about religion or knowledge about religion is supposed to happen in other subjects, and research shows that normally it will mostly be in a historical way, and you will never get up to contemporary issues. That's one thing. And the other thing is that most teachers are not well educated in that area, so it's difficult for them to teach about religion in the way that we would prefer, because they are not, maybe they are not aware of all these self-critical development and reflections that has been in the academic study of religion. And so I think that is a good argument also. And yeah, but of course, knowledge about religion is connected to literature and history and things like that. But yeah.
And then the argument should be against a separate RE subject that, as I said before, religion is a human phenomenon, and it should be taught in relation to history, art, media, and so on. So why not integrate it within history or social sciences or other subjects?
Because we do not have space. I'm just playing the devil's advocate, you know.
Yeah.
Just to emphasize this, I agree with you, of course, but you know, I can easily imagine counter-argument, you know, because curriculums are full. The students are totally burdened with other things, and in order to put another special subject in curricula, you should take something out. What should we take out of the curriculum? Why is religion more important than other things? Okay, we cannot take mathematics out. Well, maybe if we have 5 hours per week, why not 1 or 2 hours related with religion? What's our answer to this nasty argument? Which we do hear often, don't we?
Yeah, it's an important part of the discussion, and then the discussion about RE becomes a part of the broader educational debate of what should children actually learn in school. And just to play along as the devil's advocate, in most European countries in which there are a separate subject for RE, there are usually 1 hour per week, maybe 2 at the most. The third year of upper secondary in Norway is quite exceptional. That's the grade 13. After 13 years in school, you have 3 hours per week, and that's quite rare. Usually it's 1 or 2 hours. And you might ask, what can you achieve within a RE subject when you have pupils in school aged 9, 10, 11, and you have 1 hour per week? What can you actually achieve within that 1 hour, that one lecture or one class?
So not only that you want to introduce another subject into curriculum, you're not satisfied with 1 hour per week, you want more.
You can easily argue that if we could teach 5 hours per week,
it would not be enough.
It would not be a problem to find things to teach about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But one of the main concerns also when we talk about education and schooling is why? Should we educate the children to be experts in religions, or should we have some other general aims? So why this RE subject? And when you see across Europe how RE is described, it's related to a number of other issues, overarching aims. And you have in Northern Europe, especially in the Nordic countries, you relate RE, even though it's non-confessional and it has nothing to do with the church, in theory at least. You have the question of national identity. It's important for Norwegian people or children to learn something about Christianity because it's an important part of the national heritage. That's one typical argument that you find in, I think, most Nordic countries. So it's related to identity. And it's also also in the Norwegian, the Nordic countries and Germany related to the question of citizenship. How do we create citizens for the 21st century? A citizen in the 21st century should know something about the contemporary society, and just if you look around, if you open a newspaper, if you go to the internet, if you watch the news, you will always find that religion is playing a role in some way or another. And as a citizen, it's important to be aware of the role that religion plays in society, but also be aware of that religion can be used or abused in different ways. So it's also a matter of critical thinking. So in order to educate our children, it's important to educate them in order to create critical thinkers and relate that to citizenship and create a sort of creators that, or paint a picture that they have a responsibility as they grow up to be citizens in a larger society. And that is also part of the picture where they can engage in discussions and identify how religion plays a part in the society in different ways.
Karna mentioned teachers and education of teachers. This is of course one of very important issues and questions. If we agree that we should teach about religion, then the next question is who should teach about religion? And we fight around this again and again and again, right? Because the church representatives would say that it's obvious that theologians should teach about religion because they know religion the most. Within religious studies, there is not a broad consensus, but it's many religious studies scholars, majority of religious studies scholars would be skeptical to this and would say, no, it's difficult. It's difficult because you are, as a theologian, you observe everything from within one religion, and that's a problem because we should develop a perspective which is distanced perspective, which somehow enables the teacher to teach in a neutral way about more than one religion, right? But we still hear often these objections, and we say, how can you teach about religion if you're not religious yourself? Right? So do we have, I mean, we do have some arguments right, about this, but it's still, it's a non-resolved issue.
But again, it's a question of what kind of school subject is religion. Is it a subject like history and literature, art history perhaps? Or is it a subject like sports or art, a subject where you develop skills in doing a thing, in doing religion? And some religious education programs try to do a bit of both and to provide for spiritual development, whatever that means along the way. And in that case, maybe people that engage in spiritual development have a role to play as teachers. But if we think of it as a knowledge subject, and if we forget about making an exception for religion as a school subject, if we say that like any school subject, religion is based in a scientific discipline, and then the question becomes not so much who is qualified to teach. It's not about this person's religious background, because we all come from some background. Perhaps I'm not a Catholic, perhaps I'm a typical Slovene, laicist, anti-clerical person who yells at the principal at their children's school because they have Christmas songs in the Christmas program. about the institutions behind them, about ensuring that the knowledge that is presented, which is imperfect, which can always be improved, but that it has gone through a process of scientific criticism and review and improvement, a self-critical, reflective process. So then the question is, do the faculties of theology ensure that kind of open scientific inquiry, or do they have a dogmatic authority structure that ultimately prevents that kind of reflection from happening? I think that's where the question comes. Also, I would like to say that religion is very easy to teach badly. And the situation in country after country is that we have teachers who have studied whatever, history, literature, sociology, and then they have a few hours of additional teacher training in religion, and it's very difficult not to fall back on stereotypes or what you learned in school yourself and so on. And then you just end up reinforcing widespread stereotypes. So for that reason it's important that it is anchored in an academic environment where there is this kind of continuous debate that we're having around this table, for example.
Okay, thank you. So this difference between teaching religion and teaching about religion, on the other hand, this is a crucial difference, isn't it? And within the study of religions, religious studies, there is consensus, or at least majority of religious studies scholars would very much advocate for the teaching about religion and religions, rather than teaching religion. Yeah, this is true. But in reality, if we look throughout Europe, just to leave the rest of the world, because we only have a limited set of time, but still, even Europe is complicated enough. We see very different models in practice, right? Here, in Slovenia, now we are surrounded, literally surrounded with countries. Each of them, they have confessional teaching religion in one way or another within public school programs. In Scandinavia, this is different, and you have very long tradition of different approach, and that's why we are so happy that you are here with us today to learn more about this. So maybe, I don't know, maybe should you, Karna, maybe just explain a little bit how do you do it in Denmark? Because you do it for 100 years now, almost.
I did.
Well,
yeah. Well, in Denmark, we have religious education in the primary school from 1st to 9th grade level, and they would have like 1 or 2 hours each week, and it's compulsory, although there's an opt-out possibility, which is discussed often.
So opt-out means that the student and his or her parents can choose not to attend.
But not that many will use that. But it's there, and it's there for a reason. It's because we have some politicians who would like it to mainly focus on Christianity and to be this kind of national cultural citizenship, making sure that newcomers are integrated into Danish values, which they say is based on Christianity. But that's one model, and then in the upper secondary school or high school, or what we call it, gymnasium, we also have a compulsory subject, and it's completely based on a study of religion approach. It says that in the curricula that it has to be scientifically based, and to teach there you have to have a minor or major from the study of religion. So it's a very good subject, I think, and I think that is that's a really good model. But in the primary school it's a bit more complicated because we have this long tradition for a live philosophical existential approach, and where they will argue that the main goal is that the children should learn something about themselves. Sometimes we call it learning from religion, and that they should develop in an existential way. And so they argue that the subject should be taught, that the pupils will have big existential questions, and that will be the beginning, and then we'll see, what does Jesus says about life and death and things like that. So that's what I kind of criticize, because I think it looks a bit like hidden confessional, although it is supposed to be non-confessional. But that's in the primary school. But it is supposed to be non-confessional, and it is taught by teachers who's educated as teachers, and they can choose, I think, 3 what we call it, specialized topics which they are allowed to teach in. So in many ways it's a good situation, but it could be better. I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when it comes to teaching, just to add something to that, there's a long tradition within the study of religions to discuss insider and outsider perspective. And that kind of discussion is very important in RE, because it says something about the idea of study of religions-based RE should be.
When you say RE, you mean religious education,
Yeah.
just to emphasize this. RE, religious education.
Yeah. Once again, RE, religious education.
Yes. Thank you.
And it's mostly used as an abbreviation for our religious education as a separate subject in school. So when I talk about RE, it's as a separate subject in school. But you interrupted me. Outside perspectives, and that says something about what the study of religions-based RE should be, and why Karna is not completely happy about the Danish situation. It says something about teaching about and not teaching religion, as Aleš also mentioned before. And you have all these analogies trying to provide examples on what an outsider perspective might be. You have an American, it's a quite funny, I think, American scholar, he's called Craig Markin, who compares teaching and studying religion with watching birds. You can get a lot of knowledge about watching birds, how they fly, hide in the nest, and so on. But you don't necessarily want to fly, or you don't have to fly in order to be a good bird watcher. And he says that it's the same with religion. You can get a lot of knowledge about religion, studying religion, researching religion, without being religious. But in the end, it's something different, studying religion and being religious. Another thing with the outsider perspective, again, when I teach at my university, I'm a teacher, I work and teach a teacher education. For those students that are specializing in RE, is a kind of a mind-breaking for them when I introduce insider and outsider perspectives. And I find that interesting because I don't think that's so revolutionary in a way. It's quite basic. But it's, when you challenge students to think about how they look at things in a personal way, based on their personal experience and their values, it's quite different from approaching it analytically, critically, investigating what those ideas might be a part of or an example of. So insider and outsider perspectives is something that is quite crucial in explaining different models of RE, but also educating good teachers.
And that should be one of the main aims also of RE, to be able to see the difference between inside and outside.
But then again, you also have the the argument, counter-argument that, well, the study of religions, the arguments for study of religions-based RAE is that it's a kind of neutral perspective. And you have a counter-argument that saying if you stand outside, if you take an outsider perspective on religion, that's not really neutral. It can be argued that that is also a position that has that implies some critique on religion, and critique is not neutral, or is it?
But I think there's a scholar in Denmark, and he's made a good argument about when you're doing research, then you can be normative about your approaches and the way of doing research. And I think we can apply that for RE as well. You can be normative about how the frames should be, or that we approach religion as a human thing. But we are not normative about what the pupils should learn, if they should become more tolerant, or what they should think about things. So I think we can separate these.
And then neutrality is all about taking the outside perspective in order to treat different religions in the same manner, and not highlight or present one religion as better or more important than the other, but in order to treat every religion in the same way, to study it in the same way, you have to have a distance and think critically about how you approach and how you deal with the different religious traditions. And that's, of course, also important if you want to label yourself as, or the study of religions approach as a scientific approach in the study of religion.
Bengt-Ove mentioned the importance of educating people for citizenship, and just to continue on that. The thing is, we are living in an irreducibly plural society. We have different faith commitments or not. We have different ideologies, and the ideal of a liberal democracy is that we're somehow all going to get along despite these differences, and that the state is not supposed to impose one thick view of what a society should be like. I think religious education is actually a unique subject in training people to understand differences. It's unique for two reasons. One is that religion has a special legal status in our societies. We have the right to religious freedom. It's guaranteed by constitutions and international conventions. This places strict restrictions on how schools may teach religion. That is one thing. The other thing is that, like no other subject, religious education requires us to enter into other people's heads. In literature, when we learn literature in school, we learn to interpret for ourselves what this text means. In religious education, we have to deal with how other people interpret it as well. And we have to take into account that they have traditions of dealing with these texts, and that these traditions matter today. And I think the value of a good religious education subject comes through when we start talking about the other topic that we have been dealing with today, religious symbols in schools, and the controversies over headscarves and crucifixes in classrooms, and so on and so forth. Where the headscarf is painted either is painted in public debate as either political or as a religious thing that should not be allowed in a secular space, whereas crucifixes in the same debates are presented as cultural. This is exactly the kind of debate where you have to step back, take the comparative view that Bengt-Ove was talking about, look at the tradition of what the crucifix has meant to people, go out and ask women why they wear the headscarf and so on. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Are there any comments or questions at this point from the audience? As I promised, we are open for the discussion. So any remarks, any questions?
Yeah.
Please.
Maybe. The teaching about the religion is practically not very old fact, because this is a product of the 20th century. For example, only in Slovenia, at the beginning of the 20th century, more than half of all teachers were only the teacher of inside religious, theologians, and the religious explanations were not pro-choice, but this was a very serious subject, and also this type of thinking was integrated on all other subjects. So the teaching, the religious teaching, after the in the time of socialist order, was separated, and also in the frame of churches only. But now, after the change of the social political system in Slovenia, Catholic Church has a very serious objective to introduce this proper inside religious teaching into the public schools. And this is one of two objectives which is not yet realized, but this is a long-running objective, and a lot of efforts are connected in this how to realize this objective. And also I have a question. I agree entirely with this approach of teaching about religion on the basis of acknowledgement that religion is a human being's product or social product. And my question is, do you explain this human being product also in the connection or from the two-sex society, also from the feminist perspective? This means who from this human being is practically the producer of religious explanations, of religious statements and so on, religious norm especially, and how, if this is practiced through this integral approach, which are the consequences of such an explanation of religious explanation, because the feminist researchers in the last 3 or 4 decades discovered that no one woman never has been the creator of the religious explanations and so on. And is this, I can say, feminist perspective already included into the teaching at the level of elementary schools?
Thank you, Mette. Excellent question. Does RE include feminist critic? Does neutral teaching about religion includes feminist criticism?
Yeah.
To answer from the Norwegian context, question of sex and gender is not included in primary school, but in upper secondary school it's included. And questions related to sex and gender has to be a part of dealing with every religion: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism. Those are the religions mentioned in the curriculum. But what you address here is extremely important, I think, and it's a part of the broader deconstruction of religion and what religion really is. And I think, and I have been challenged from some colleagues to address feminist perspectives in RE teaching and in the development of RE, because it's not a perspective that is often dealt with. And a part of that is because of the study of religion-based RE is quite new. But it should not be an excuse, because it's an important part of deconstructing religion. And as a part of that, I, together with a master's student, she analyzed pictures in textbooks for upper secondary, 3 textbooks. And she analyzed pictures in the chapters on Christianity and Islam. And she found that every picture in the chapters on Islam, women were either with headscarves completely covered or in a passive role behind the men. When there were both sexes, of both men and women at the same pictures, the women were always passive, in standing one step behind. And if you deal with pictures as a kind of text within a text, that gives quite a strong impression of women and the role between gender within religion. And it's extremely important to deconstruct that as well. And I was quite surprised when we sat down and analyzed the pictures how massive that was.
But I actually think it's one more argument that it should be a study of religion-based approach, because in the study of religion we have discussed feminist critique and post-colonial critique and all that, and try to I try to, when I educate teachers, that when I present, we have about Christianity, I would say who's the insider and who's the authority, and I'll try to incorporate all this critique also. And, diversity, of course, and who speaks here, and But I think it's present in the Danish upper secondary school. It would be part of the teaching group as well.
And sorry, one question. Is in the level of elementary school, in the teaching also the answer to the question, which is usually in everyday life, why the majority of church visitors are women? Is also in the teaching included the answer.
Yeah, I think so. I think you will find questions like that in
people ask
textbooks.
so in
Yeah,
day.
yeah.
It is normally. Okay.
Any other questions or comments? I'm sure there must be. No? Okay, Christian already started to lead, at least partly, to that second universe of issues and tough questions about encounters of contemporary public school and religion. This is the question of symbols, religious symbols, and which appear in contemporary public school in many ways, and of course it's very often connected with problems, with disagreements, with political and cultural fights, and so on and so on. It also opens, of course, the question of legal arrangements, constitutional arrangements, the question of secularity, modern secular arrangements, different models. French model, which is, of course, very strict, very straightforward. It does not allow any presence of any religion in public spaces. And school is, of course, a paradigmatic example of public space. So in France, nothing is allowed. You have some other extremes, and Christian very convincingly exposed this double standards we sometimes used. Italian example is probably the most well-known example, especially after the second decision of the European Court of Human Rights, which confirmed the decision of Italian courts that it is not against secular standards if the crosses hang on the walls of public schools. But at the same time, we do not have problems to forbid Muslim female students to enter the schools with headscarves, and so on and so on. So, I don't know, maybe, of course, we see very different models in practice. Different countries have different models. So maybe, Christian, you want to just please go on.
Yes, just.
No, go on, just take your time.
Well, that was an example of the debate, but if you look at the decision, for example, in the Italian case on crucifixes in classrooms, it wasn't. Then they did not apply the double standard.
Oh yes,
has to be said.
Sorry, yeah.
I was thinking more about debates in Bavaria, really, but we have had the European Court of Human Rights case in Italy, where a woman wanted to bring up her children in accordance with her secular values and wanted crucifixes to be removed from classrooms. And this went through Italian courts and said a lot of strange things about the meaning of crosses, and it ended up in the European Court of Human Rights.
Which accepted two different decisions.
Yes, first they agreed that crosses should be removed, crucifixes should be removed, then it went to the Grand Chamber of the European Court, and they agreed that Italy could keep the crucifixes. And a main argument that they used was actually that it's no problem to wear a headscarf in an Italian school, or that Italy makes a lot of accommodations for other religions. So for that reason, people were free to have the religion they wanted, and in light of this pluralist orientation of Italian schools, the crucifixes did not have any strong indoctrinating effect. So if you look at these decisions, you can see that they do evaluate the context in which supposed violations of religious freedom happens and take things into account. But one problem with these judgments, I think, is that they take it as read that a state with a strong secularist approach is even-handed, that they treat all religions equally, and that for this reason, the question of indirect discrimination, for example, if headscarves are banned from schools, does not come up. And this is a very tricky argument to make in the case of Switzerland or France, but especially Turkey, which has a lot of these cases. And well, it just goes to show that we need religious education in the course.
Yeah, thank you, Christian, for this clarification. Of course, Bavarian case, relatively recent Bavarian case, is of course much more visible and problematic. We remember still, right? It's this year, right? The beginning of this year, the Bavaria elected new right-wing government, and immediately they started to put crosses in public schools with a very clear and loud justification that this is maybe a religion, but it's much more than that. It is part of who we are. It is part of our tradition, and that's why it's totally normal that we put it there, because this is who we Bavarians are. Of course, it opens all kinds of dilemmas and questions, and about life in 21st century, and about, of course, how to educate and prepare the kids to be good citizens, to be fully empowered persons in this life which is awaiting them. And this life is controversial, and it is inevitably connected with encounters of different cultures and different religions in the surroundings where we live. Right? In spite of the walls we try to build, as Donald Trump or many other examples, unfortunately. Yeah?
Another thing that I think the question of religious symbols in school display is that you often hear that religion has become a private matter in the 21st century. All those cases related to religious symbols in school show that religion is not just a private matter. It's a highly official public matter in different ways, and especially in school. And it's an extremely complicated field because it involves law, and it involves culture, and it involves persons' feelings, and it also involves human rights, questions related to religious freedom, freedom to express your religion, but it also relates to the question or the interpretation, understanding of religious freedom as not being exposed to religion or forced. That symbols will be forced upon you when you enter public spaces. So it's a number of different things that
plus political power.
Yeah,
because the churches are in the possession of political power. And
I think it's too simple just to say churches.
Plus, of course, not only churches. I agree. Yeah.
Because religious symbols have become so important, also for politicians, because it's not only religious, they can't be explained or interpreted as cultural symbols as well. So we as Christians, that kind of reasoning is something that you hear from politicians. And they culturally size, even those that even if politicians are not necessarily that religious, they use religious symbols as part of their arguments, especially related to nationality and national identity. And it's religious symbols in the public sphere is extremely difficult because it involves so much. And you have, again, different cases in almost every European country with different reasoning, different outcomes.
Sure. And this is my next question, of course. It's saying that it is complex and complicated and so on. But that's not enough, of course. If we, as religious scholars, are asked, and sometimes we are, many times we are not, but sometimes they ask us, even the state, the Ministry of Education, they ask us, please, with your knowledge, help us with these dilemmas. Do we have good recommendations? Because these dilemmas are complex and heavy, and there are not no clear-cut solutions, of course. It's always some compromise and so on. It's we don't have clear recipes, do we? They don't exist. What do we do? How do we?
Well, one thing is that we could point out when politicians are saying on the one hand that the case of Denmark is that they want the right-wing political parties, politicians, they would like to restrict Muslim practice. So they will, for example, they just this bill passed against wearing burqa or niqab, and there are only about 200 women in Denmark wearing this, so it's completely or only symbolic politics. And they, in their argumentations, they would say that Denmark is a secular, pluralistic, tolerant, and human rights and things like that. But at the same time, they want to prohibit or restrict Muslim practice. And they would like to keep the special status of the majority religion, that is the Evangelical Lutheran Christianity. So some schools, they try to avoid going to church the last day before Christmas, and it went up to the political level, and so they are, they show double moral when they discuss this, and the least we can do is point that out, I guess, without giving a clear answer, but yeah.
It's very important, I think, and it is part of our job, but many times it's not enough. Let me be more concrete, for example. I mean, I was, in the last 10 years, I was with some other colleagues, some small group of colleagues, asked twice to try to write some academically justified guidelines which would help the ministry to ask very concrete questions, usually coming from the headmasters of the schools. You know, like for example, there are 2 girls coming to our classes with headscarves on. What do we do? There are 2 Muslim girls who do not want to attend swimming classes because they claim it's against their religion and they should not expose their bodies, especially when the male students are around. And all kinds of these things. You know. There is one mother, this is a concrete case we just had a few weeks ago, one mother attending school event covered with burqa completely, and some worried citizen, other mother, passionately asked the headmaster to explain this and to prevent this, and so on and so on. So I agree, of course we try to deconstruct double standards and warn stuff, and this is important and we should do this, but I'm afraid that this is the easiest part of the job. Then when you come to these complicated and very concrete questions, then you have to advise something. Or we can still stay a little bit reserved, but for somebody sitting there at the chair of the Ministry of Education, then he or she has to decide this is how it is or not, right? So, but we have, I mean, are we efficient with this when we are asked? Does our research, information and knowledge we have, of course it helps us, but yeah, do we have good answers?
We cannot resolve the question. That would be scientism.
Okay.
Knowledge of religion does not equip us to resolve what is essentially a political, legal and problem.
Why on earth are we paying you then that we would hear this and then they would immediately close the all religious studies departments if you need to come out from publicly with this? Because they are closing departments around. They just closed one department in Budapest, gender studies, and it's not easy, it's not so difficult to imagine that this argument would be really put in practice, and they would say, if you cannot provide us with answers, why the hell are we investing in you? Go and do something useful.
But, I mean, even worse, we also have to, since these are questions that involve individual rights, there is no general rule that either we or anybody else can state that will resolve all cases, because every case has to be addressed individually. And then the courts should and sometimes will look at such issues as who is using this religious symbol? Is it the state? by putting crucifixes on walls of classroom? Is it agents of the state? Is it a teacher with a headscarf? Or is it a private individual who is forced to attend school because school attendance is mandatory? Is it a pupil wearing a headscarf or a cross or a Sikh turban? Those issues of power and of individuals versus state should be asked. And then there are other questions that we can help inform, such as and these are often very, very basic questions that are asked because in policy and law people really don't know these matters at all. Is it the case that Muslim girls are always wearing headscarves because they are pressured to do so by their fathers? Actually, we have a ton of research showing that women have very many reasons for wearing headscarves, sometimes even in rebellion against their parents who come from a secularist generation, right? So we can bring in that kind of knowledge, and then another set of questions comes into play, namely the question of the autonomy of the individual, the autonomy of these girls versus paternalist policies that try to protect them from themselves by telling teenage girls what to wear and what to wear. We can also bring in some other perspectives, like we have a ton of historical knowledge about what happens when the state regulates these things, when the state tries to effect cultural change, modernization, integration by regulating external press. We have a lot of experience with that from Muslim countries like Turkey and Iran. And we know one thing, it politicizes the issue enormously when the state does that as opposed to a more laissez-faire attitude. So that's the sort of thing we can do. We can't solve every problem. You should still pay us.
Well, our challenge as scholars, I think, is that we are often expected to provide some general answers that can be applied for every special cases or problems that occur, and that's of course difficult because it also, like the example you gave with this one mother in burqa and the other concerned mother criticizing this, also has to do with their individual rights in some way or another, and that's when it becomes complicated. And it's also a part of, if we start to provide answers, you should know, have that kind of knowledge about culture, and if you have that kind of knowledge, you will have this universal key that will solve any problem. That will be also be wrong in some way, because there are also individual rights part of these issues, and that's our main one of our main problems, not just as scholars of religions, but in humanities, that people are important, because culture, as religion, culture does not exist in itself. It only exists through people and people's expressions and interpretations of the culture. So we cannot advise on an individual level all the time. That would be impossible, I think, without knowing that specific case and enter that specific case in a way. Because also when it comes to people, the cultural explanation or the religious explanation has its limitations because we all have our personality that goes along with our cultural and religious background, which also is part of religion.
Yeah, of course, I deliberately, of course, pushed the question very hard from the analytical reasons just to try to think about it. And of course, this is impossible. But on the other hand, you know, Christian, you quite convincingly explained, of course, and emphasized how each case is different and unique and complex and so on. But this probably does not mean that any kind of general rules or guidelines, at least, are not possible, right? It does not mean that. So we can help with this, with some kind of general guidelines. Because the Ministry of Education of the serious state should have at least some kind of general guidelines which they could distribute among schools, so the headmasters would not call each and every time to the ministry and ask, what should we do now? So at least some things. And we can help there with some general knowledge, general research data we have, and so on and so on.
Well, actually, they do not have that in Denmark. It is the,
They don't?
No, it is the school leader who decides each time. Yeah. So we don't have any issue. Yeah.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. So we're not too worse in the world. Even Denmark, precious, bright example, same thing.
Yeah.
If I may, I mean, it's not obvious that you're right, that the state should have guidelines. And that has been the debate in Scandinavia, whether it's best to deal with these questions as quietly, discreetly, locally as possible. Leave it up to every headmaster to deal with the actual persons involved. Whether that is better or whether there should be a circular from the ministry telling the headmasters what to do. And many headmasters will want that circular because they don't want to know what to do and they face these problems. But on the other hand, as I pointed out before, once you have that circular, it becomes a focus of political activity, usually not very constructive. And the headscarf becomes a means of rebellion.
Yeah, so it's also connected to the fact that I think in Scandinavian country there's a high degree of authority given to the local municipalities and schools to decide in school matters. So they would oppose that the government would say do this and do that.
So I'm not arguing for or against it. I'm just saying that this is a choice that has to be made at the outset before we start discussing what should go into the guidelines, whether it is practically prudent to do it.
Okay. Our roundtable is slowly approaching an end, so I'm repeating my call for any questions or comments or thoughts, ideas, whatever you might have, before we slowly conclude this talk. No? You sure?
I would like to know what's your personal opinion on religious symbols in schools like hijab or crosses or any kind of religious symbols that students wear, not in, on the walls or something.
Okay, so what do we think? Whether should the school allow pupils, you mean primary school?
Yes.
Yeah, primary school. Should the school or the state, whatever, allow students to wear scarves, headscarves and turbans and whatever, or not? This is your question, eh? What do we think about it?
I think, why not? It does not bother me.
Burkas also, or is there a line somewhere?
Burka is, when I think about it, I immediately feel that there's something different when your face is covered, because in my teaching I do believe having eye contact is important in order to present something, to give a lecture. But on the other hand, even if I think that, it's not necessarily so that the girl or the woman wearing a burqa does not necessarily get something from being a part of teaching. And principally, I would say that would challenge me, but I would say okay. And I would think that it's better that she is attending teaching compared, or if the alternative would be that she stays. So that would be my answer.
Do you have anything to add?
No, absolutely.
You would
Yeah.
sign on with this?
Yeah.
Christy?
Sorry, did someone research the family pressure on the young pupils? Does someone have some results on the investigation of this family environment, and mostly from the father pressure on children and also on women's or female education role?
This is the basic question, whether the scarf or burqa is
Yeah,
a
yeah,
matter of
the-
free choice or is it imposed on these people?
I have read some research about hijabs on young children, and that in some European countries, young girls start wearing hijab earlier compared, this was done I think among immigrants and or immigrants environments, and they started earlier compared to their country of origin. So they started, I think it was at age 4 or 5, when it was more common that they started at 8, 9, 10 in their home country.
But this generation, which is born already in Norway, for example,
Yeah.
the second generation of immigrants.
They start, I've seen some research or age group 10 to 12, but they're quite usual that it is even later, and that the girls will decide themselves if they want to wear the hijab or not. And there have been actually I think 2 or 3 books that are called hijab stories, that Muslim girls tell their story about deciding whether to wear hijab or not, and how that reflected in their family.
In Slovenia, in some cases, this female decision depends from the payment. I know very well of a lot of cases in some regions or part of Slovenia, for example, Jesenice, where exactly the exact sum of money was given to the young girls to be in this masculine mode of young race.
There is Saudi money around Europe, all around Europe, with which they pay young girls if they wear hijabs.
I never heard that.
Yeah.
About that. No.
Yeah.
These are such similar cases also in other countries, or is this very hidden?
I haven't read about it. Have you came across it in some?
I have heard this story many times in the region, but
The question whether it's
I mean, where do we have this information from?
From my postgraduate student, who made the master's work here, and she was very well informed about the everyday practice.
She interviewed the girls.
She observed in everyday life in Jesenice what is going on. So observation is also very important.
Well, what's interesting is that hijab is a symbol with different meanings also in Muslim environments. And I've read many in those books, there are many stories that relate hijab to freedom, which quite contradicts the normal Norwegian way of thinking
Freedom
about
under
hijab.
male domination. So, this is objective explanation. This is also the knowledge about freedom is not from the spiritual sphere, but from the very concrete human being.
No, this is what Professor Jorgen is emphasizing. I think it's a very, very important point. It's freedom under the broader circumstances of male domination. And I think this is very important to understand when we are thinking how to answer this very good question. You know, what should we do? Should we allow this or not? Because if we do not allow even the more radical coverage in the public space without deconstructing the broader male-dominating system, then we have done just the opposite what we want. We have done this in the name of the freedom of these students, but we've done exactly what you also mentioned, you know, because the alternative for this concrete girl would be that whether she is here or she is not. It's not the alternative whether she will remove her burqa or not. It's the alternative whether she will be in my class or whether she will not be in my class. So that's why this is so important to understand. Without we have at least weakened the broader male-dominated system around, we can do just the opposite what we want. So that's why this is such a complicated and complex question which we received. Yes.
I agree with that. Though I think there are limits to how much we should think in terms of socially engineering one outcome or another when what we are faced with is one girl dressed in some way who comes to class. We can think about how this fits into a patriarchal power structure and whether this will imply a pressure on other girls to do the same, and whether we can effect change by forbidding this dress. But at the end of the day, the outcome is that this one girl will or will not be allowed to go to class in the headscarf. And I'm a little, also when studying the court's decisions on this, I'm a little worried that too much emphasis is placed on hypothetical social effects of this and that, and a little too little on the individual case. One other point that I wanted to bring up is that we are dealing with these Islamic symbols so much because there is this sense of group threat. Muslims are coming here and taking over. And you have exactly the same dynamics within the Muslim community, certainly the Muslim community that we have here in Slovenia and in Bosnia. Exactly the same reaction to the kind of Salafi Gulf Islam that has been coming in with the Soleimani that was mentioned. Actually, the Islamic high school in Sarajevo, early in the 2000s, they expelled a girl from the school because she was wearing niqab, the face covering. And this, they said, was not the Bosnian Muslim tradition. So it's an exact copy of how we in Norway react to headscarves. This is not our cultural tradition. They're doing the same thing, it's just on a slightly different level. No to burqas and niqabs, but not to the headscarf. Which also means, and this is the point that's important when we're talking about guidelines. We also have to understand that it's not simply a question of getting the official Muslim view on these things. So does Islam require these girls to wear headscarves? Yes or no? Is this a religious freedom issue? Yes or no? It's not that easy. The Islamic Mufti in Slovenia will say that you don't need to wear burqas. In fact, we recommend that you don't. But there are different opinions of this on this within the Muslim community, and the structure of authority is such that you cannot point to a pronouncement by the Pope and say this is the doctrine. So there's another complicating factor.
Please.
Yeah, thank you for, I believe, not only for me but also for the rest of us here, very instructive and information-full approach you've offered to us. I particularly appreciate your considerations related to relational type of approach to the questions, although at least at certain point this is becoming a bigger question, more frequent one. And then, at least out of my also personal experience, I can see why they want you to have a bit more precise ideas how to address the questions. You know, when it is actually really singular, I like your idea. Don't do more out of it than it is. But when it is not, that's how I read the development in France when they went, in my eyes, too far in restrictions. But when I was following two decades ago, the development when they had this approach, tackle it individually, and when it is not disturbing the wider environment, let it be. Yeah, but it was not that simple. You are far more informed about what was going on than I am, but at least, even from my position, it seemed that it was not always good enough. This is remark. Then I have a question. I had the privilege to be at the point where groups of people were coming with their ideas what was supposed to be obligatory subject for all the pupils in Slovenian schools. Yeah? I would be able to count up to 30 additional subjects, and groups of actors coming from the field, they would all have more or less persuasive ideas why this should be a subject. If I go through few of them, artificial intelligence for the future, you know, it's a must. I can gather together at least such a number of prominent experts arguing for it. In Slovenia right now, the ones telling to all of us that computer programming knowledge is a must. Nation will disappear without it. Then well-being of the citizens is, in Nordic countries, very prominent topic as far as I can understand from Finnish experience. Nutrition studies, and environmental studies, gender studies, master degree, I suppose, ethics, sports, logic. I've even heard that chess is supposed to be obligatory. Yeah, chess playing, yes. Nice exercise. Yeah. In case you are there to decide what it is going to be with your children in the school, in the classroom, yeah, being there, more than 10 hours per day, how would you then react to the idea that all the subjects are supposed to be obligatory? Who is going to decide which one really should be integrated, while this is a relational question, into the teaching process, or separate one, while it is so important? Chess is also important, believe me. And this is a provocation, of course.
Do we have any answers to this mean provocation from I posed this question, but in much more mild version before, and this is just
it's highly relevant. because right now in Norway we have there's a process of developing new curriculum for the whole school system. And there have been before that started, it was a white paper, and it was a group of experts who presented their recommendations for the future school. And a number of those things, not all, that you mentioned was a part of that report as well, that there are some issues that a school for the future should address. So the solution, it seems, in Norway, and I think partly in Denmark and Sweden, is that you have developed some core elements. Some of the things that were presented as possible separate subjects is instead core elements that should be addressed in every subject. And I don't know if I can translate it, but in English, but one of those core elements is in Norwegian, maybe Christian can help me with
managing life.
Yeah, how to manage life. And a part of that is to explain what it's all about. Nutrition is a part of that, because to manage your own life is be able to identify the right food to eat, which keep you healthy in a physical way. So that the nutrition part is a part of home economics. In RE, livsmestring, or how to master life, is related to ethics and related to questions on environment and ethical questions in our town. I think it's the draft says. So a part of the answer could be that some of those issues are better as core elements than separate subjects in order to integrate, to have an integrated system, and in order to teach pupils that things are related. But yeah, the question still stands. I don't think I gave a fully satisfactory answer. Should RE be a subject school? What's the arguments still? One of the things related to RE that is different, and I think that is different from the examples that you mentioned, artificial intelligence, nutrition, and chess, not chess necessarily, but religion is something that is highly contemporary, as well as a very important part of history and culture. And it's in itself integrated in that sense, and therefore should be taught separately and not integrated. Because if you integrate it, you lose some of the important parts of religions that might be related to gender, or that might be related to power, and that might be related to contemporary issues. But your question is highly relevant, and we also talked earlier today that a lot of what is happening in school is all about, or it is related to skills more than knowledge. And some of the competences, yeah. And some of the things that you mentioned, computer programming, chess, artificial intelligence, points to the future, and is related to an educational debate about what the future school should be. It should be about educating pupils, training them in skills that relates to creative thinking, solving problems, and that's the important thing that and what should be addressed in school.
And also I think you can argue that I'm not sure that RE has to be from first grade level. Maybe it's better to wait, at least because I know in Denmark it becomes a bit problematic, the teaching in first, second and third grade, because it's mostly biblical stories, and so I think it would be easier to have an argument if we say, okay, maybe we should wait until fourth grade level, or when they're able to understand all this and discuss and have. But it has never been a discussion in Denmark whether or not it should be there.
But that's an interesting question, and I envy natural scientists who can go to a laboratory and do their thing in the laboratory. We can't.
The controlled environment.
Yeah, we can't do an experiment with RE, just removing it from the school system and see what happens.
You can do that, but to get it back to school again, that's but you can do it.
But we have to wait for several years in order to get a result.
Well,
Yeah.
the discipline is longer than the individual's life, so. Okay, any other questions or comments, ideas, whatever you want to share with us? No? You sure? Okay, can we conclude? Well, no, thank you very much. Thank you, our dear guests, and all of you to attend this. We haven't provided any final answers, no recipes from us, but as Christian emphasized, at the same time, and no conclusions, strict conclusions, but at the same time, we still are a little bit, just a little bit useful and valuable, so they can still finance our research and our salaries, I guess. So thank you very much. It is. Thank you very much all, and have some of our home meat. Thank you. Yeah.